Great. We are going to learn some Gemara. This week's Torah portion is Tetzaveh, and of course, early next week is Purim, and so we're going to sort of talk about how the two things fit together, which is, I think, really exciting. So can everybody see this? Yes?
I have to pinch it out. I'm on a phone, so
Sure. That's okay. We'll make sure to read it out so that people can see it. Jackie, hello.
Is this the parsha that Moshe's name is not mentioned?
Off the top of my head, I'm not sure.
I know it's one of these right in through here, and the relationship to Purim is that God's name isn't mentioned in the Megillah. Nice.
That's cool. That's a cool connection. Yeah. Well, that's not what we're going to talk about today, although certainly possible. I wouldn't say I know confidently. I don't think that's something I have in my head. So I'm sorry. I don't have a good answer. So this is Masechet Megillah. And we're on page 12a, I believe. Now, just as a side note, Masechet Megillah, as you might imagine, is loosely about Megillat Esther, a few of the other Megillot. It talks about Torah reading and services, and it's a very practical Masechet, actually. It's not super duper long. And I'll just say personally, it was the very first Masechet of Mishnah and Talmud that I ever learned. So I have a very close connection to Purim. My birthday is next week, or this week, or next week. And so Purim and Masechet Megillah, and I feel there's just a good connection here. So we're going to learn that. This section of Masechet Megillah goes through various of the verses the various verses. Give me one sec here. Sorry, I just got someone wants to join and sent me a message. Great. And it sort of goes through the verses. And so we're going to take sort of a very detailed look at the first few verses of the Megillat Esther through the lens of the Talmud. And yeah, that's what we're going to do. Okay. Can I get and it'll quote this week's parsha, which is why this is relevant. And I think in an interesting way. Can I get a volunteer to read this first paragraph here with a little with a little red symbol?
I will read.
Please, thank you.
My camera will be off.
That's okay.
Otherwise, I can't see it. Okay. The Gemara returns to its interpretations of verses in the Megillah. The Megillah mentions that among those invited to the king's feast were, quote, the army of Persia and Media, the nobles, unquote, and princes of the provinces, and is written near the conclusion of the Megillah in the book of Chronicles of the kings of Media and Persia. Why is Persia mentioned first at the beginning of the Megillah, while later in the Megillah, Media is mentioned first? I hope I pronounced that right. Rabbi said in response, these two peoples, the Persians and the Medes, stipulated with each other, saying, if the kings will come from us, the ministers will come from you. If the kings will come from you, the ministers will come from us. How do you pronounce that word? Media, then?
So Media. In the Hebrew, it's Madai here.
Okay.
But the transliteration between English and Hebrew always being sort of okay. Like Persia is Faras here. Faras. So don't get too lost in that. I think it's okay.
Okay. Therefore, in references to kings, I say Media is mentioned first, whereas in connection with nobles and princes, Persia is given priority.
All right, awesome. So, this section of Talmud is going sort of interpreting the parts of Megillah, and each chapter sort of talks about a different subject in the Masechet. And so here it asks, you remember the Talmud and of course ourselves are close readers of text, and so it says, in terms of the king's feast, right? King Achashverosh has all these feasts, is inviting all these people. It begins by saying the army of Persia and Media, right, of Faras Umadai, the nobles and the princes of the provinces. So we were sort of looking closely at the order of the words, Persia and Media. And then a few chapters later, almost at the very end, right? It's the penultimate verse from in Megillat Esther. It says, in the book of Chronicles of the Kings of Media and Persia. And so the rabbis, always being close readers of text, want to know, why is the order of the names not in the same order? I'm sure all of you were thinking that when you first read this verse, right?
First thing I thought of.
The first thing you thought of. But we this comes up in other cases as well, where Aaron and we were talking about Moshe, right? Not necessarily in this week's parsha, but in a number of places, Aaron and Moses' names are the order changes and
Transposed, yeah.
I'm sorry, Jackie.
Just they were transposed, right?
Right, exactly.
The most prominent one I can think of is in the Ten Commandments, with mother and father in one place and father and mother in the other.
Oh, I don't think I actually knew that, but that's a great example, right? These are the kinds of things the rabbi is going to pay close attention to, and as a result, give us the opportunity to derive extra meaning. So the rabbis asked the question. Here it says Persia and Media. The other places says Media and Persia. Why is one named first and the other one named first later? Rava said in response, right? This is what Eric had read. These two peoples, the Persians and the Medes, or I guess, stipulated with each other. This answer sort of blows me away, saying, if the kings will come before us, the ministers will come before you, and if the kings will come before you, the ministers will come from us. Meaning to say, there's some sort of negotiation involved in terms of who is given priority in terms of being named first. Now, what I find so fascinating about this is Rava's answer that the negotiation between the Persians, right, the Persia and Media, is going to dictate what Megillat Esther says, or at least that we're taking Megillat Esther as enough evidence to be accurately describing what King Ahasuerus was doing. Now, I think this comes in conflict with our general understanding that Megillat Esther is a farce, is a book of a farce, right? It's a farce book. I'm not saying this very well. It is written with a sense of humor. It is meant to be read with a sense of parody and satire and farce. And so here, for us to read very close details about the negotiations being countries, I think is so fascinating.
So the 127 provinces that are referred to in the Megillah refers to Persia only?
I'm sorry?
I believe the Megillah mentions 127 provinces or some huge number. Is that all Persia?
No, that's a good question. I don't know off the top of my head. What we're going to do, let's take a quick detour and look up the Megillat Esther and look at those first few verses. I think probably should have done that to start with, but it'll give us a little extra context. So let me change the screen. Here, and just everybody can welcome Maddie, who's one of my students from when I lived in Pittsburgh and now lives in Portland, my hometown. And we were talking the other day and I invited her to come and join us. Can everybody see this or no?
Yep.
Yeah, okay. So here is how Megillat Esther begins with our 1985 JPS translation, right? Vayhi bimei Achashverosh, right? It happened in the days of Achashverosh, that Achashverosh, who reigned over 127 provinces, great remembering, Eric, from India to Nubia, right? In those days, when King Achashverosh occupied the royal throne in the fortress of Shushan, in the third year of his reign, he gave a feast or a banquet, which is so fascinating, right? The word is mishteh, which is like a drink, right? It's something that you drink. So a feast, a banquet has to do with drinking, at least in this context, in the word generally. For all the officials and courtiers, the sarav avadav, right? Of these sort of administrators, if you will, right? The administration of Persia and Media, the nobles and the governors of the provinces in his service, right? Meaning to say, these are people who are below King Ahasuerus. These are not his equals in the context. And then here's the next verse, right? No fewer than 180 days, Ahasuerus displayed the vast riches of his kingdom and the splendid glory of his majesty. And this is going to become relevant in a second, that the riches of his kingdom, right, is kavod malchuto, and the splendid glory of his majesty, ve'et yakar, the preciousness, tiferet gedulato. And we'll talk about that verse in a second. And Any initial thoughts about this first paragraph about comparing, the sort of negotiation between these, nations under King Achashverosh, who are sort of jockeying for sort of kavod and honor in showing up for the feast?
So does that mean that most of these these governors are from Media then? Lower.
No, I think what we're talking about is, right, imagine that King Achashverosh is creating a banquet, a party, right? He's inviting all sorts of different parts of his kingdom, and we'll talk about why Persia and Media in a later paragraph, right? And he's invited these two administrations of Persia and Media to come to the party. Are there other administrations for other parts of the kingdom? Absolutely. And there is an interesting conversation to be had later on in the paragraph, which is why Persia and Media, what are the benefits of the detractions of that choice? Does that answer the question, Eric?
Yeah.
Yeah. Other thoughts? Okay. Let's
So were there city states at that time, like Shushan is mentioned, the walls, all those things. There obviously are other town, I guess, cities of some significance. Was Shushan considered a capital, so to speak?
Yeah, it talks about Shushan in a number of different ways. I want to be really careful with the term city-state, because, right, a city-state generally refers to sort of an independent nation-state, if you will, right? But like, barring that as a thing, right? I think kingdoms come in all shapes and sizes during this period and could be included in basically a single city. I think you're right about that. And we know certainly in the times of Greeks and Romans, there were city-states. I like to think of Pittsburgh as a city-state, just sort of its own thing, but that's neither here nor there. Okay, let's read another paragraph here. Can I get another volunteer to read? Again, quoting this verse that I just read from Megillat Esther.
I can do it.
Thanks, Jackie.
Okay. The verse states, when he showed the riches of his glorious kingdom and the honor of his majestic greatness, Rabbi Yossi
He's quoting the verse, right? The Gemara is quoting the verse and is now going to interpret it. All right, keep going, Jackie.
Rabbi Yossi Bar Hanina said, this teaches that Ahasuerus wore the priestly vestments. Proof for this assertion may be adduced from the fact that the same terms are written with regard to the priestly vestments as it is written here, the riches of his glorious kingdom and the honor of his majestic greatness. And it is written there with regard to the priestly garments for glory and for majesty.
Amazing. Thank you, Jackie. So here we have, I think, such a fascinating interpretation here. One I certainly have never heard of before this. So we have this verse from the book of Esther, right? When Achashverosh showed the riches of his glorious kingdom, which we read before, right? The osher here, right? The wealth of the kavod of his kingdom. And then we have, it's not quoted in the Gemara directly, but we know that it's referring to the whole verse. And in English, Rabbi Steinsaltz has added it here, right? The majestic tiferet gedulato, its greatness. Rabbi Yossi Bar Chanina says, it's this pair of words, kavod and tiferet, that teaches us that Achashverosh wore the priestly vestments, which are relevant to this week's portion, Tetzaveh. And so how do we know this? It's quoted in Parshat Tetzaveh for glory, kavod, and majesty. Lechavod uletiferet. And as a result, because these things are quoted here and they're quoted there, we can learn from one to the next. What do people think about this? This idea that King Achashverosh, who generally is not seen in a very positive way, I mean, maybe at the end of the story, sort of, wearing something that the priest would wear. Are people uncomfortable with this? People think it's good? What do people think?
I'm not comfortable with this because that's an association to priests, Aaron, and that's a high level. And
why does it make you uncomfortable?
Because Achashverosh wasn't a priest; he was the king, And I don't think we should give him the same level of respect. It's really different situations.
If King Ahasuerus was a king of Israel, as opposed to his own kingdom, would it bother you differently?
That's different.
It would still bother me because the king is never the priest and vice versa.
Right. So for Ron, for you, the separation of powers is a problem, is important. Eric, for you, not as much of a big deal, totally fine. Right. And I think this is a conflict we see when we're talking about now a different holiday, right? In the impact of the after effects of the Hashmoneans taking over, the Maccabees taking over the temple and reconquering the land, they don't respect the separation of powers. They become both the kingship and the priesthood, and it creates a ton of problems. So I think, Ron, there's a good reason for that. And Eric, I think you're right to say, he's not really part of our people exactly here. It's sort of strange for him to wear the priestly vestments.
I find another problem.
Please, Jackie.
The problem for me is here we've told you that he's always making drinking parties. So he's probably drunk most of the time. And I wouldn't want to think of him in that context to give him the honor of priesthood when he's a drunkard.
Right. So in two ways, right? One, his personal behavior, and second, right, and we haven't even gotten to the part where he, asks his wife to dance naked in front of everybody. Probably not great behavior, to say the least. His broader context, which is debauchery in so many ways, to be then overlapping with physical items that we attribute kavod to, honor, respect, that these things are used in a praising, serving God way. For those things to be overlapped feels uncomfortable, discordant, right? And makes us, I think that's a really great point, Jackie, right? There's an overlap here that doesn't quite.
We also know we think we know that when Noah got drunk, he lost his whatever. And also Aaron's sons, one of the reasons that the sages think that they, was because they were drunk.
Right.
I believe there's also a commandment that the priest cannot be drunk when he does the sacrifices.
I don't know the specifics of that, but that seems reasonable. It seems like a reasonable policy.
They can set fire to the whole.
Yeah.
So I'm questioning why they mentioned the specific words, the priestly vestments, and that implies that it's the same vestments are described in the Torah. Now he could wear, very kingly vestments. That's fine, but to make this specific statement, that's the part that's bugging me.
Yeah, Bandy, I see you in a second. I'm going to come to you. I just want to point out this this phrase here, right? That he milamed. This teaches shelavash, that he wore bigdei kahuna, the clothes of the priesthood, right? So we want to sort of just be really specific with our languages. But you're right, Eric. It's not the same. It doesn't say he wore fancy clothes. Totally fine. He's a king, wear whatever he wants. But this feels problematic or discordant. And I would also point out, right, we're talking about an era that is after the temple is destroyed. So all the more so might feel sort of uncomfortable, right? It's a mockery almost. Yeah, Maddie.
I'm just curious from those two words, kavod and tiferet, like if there's more to unpack about what they may mean and if there's different contexts that they're used other than this one, or if it's always when they're using kavod and tiferet in this way that it's referring to priestly. Because here that's what the discussion is, but it's possible to be, I don't know, different, manifest in different ways, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, those words are often used to describe God's presence, right? And maybe part of that is because we talk about the priesthood and the temple and God's physical presence on earth in context of that, so that makes sense. We talk about God's kavod, the sort of physical, that beyond the Shekhinah, the sort of other presence, we talk about God's kavod as filling the entire world, right? In the Kedusha, for example.
Isn't it like part of the Sefirot, or am I imagining that?
Tiferet is, I don't think kavod.
Tiferet is.
Off the top of my head. Yeah. So all the more so, right? We have these words that are engendering in us these feelings of real majesty. And again, pardon a strange turn of phrase here. And we're also talking about a king. We're talking about the priesthood. There's a lot of, I think, overlap here. The Gemara moves on. It doesn't spend any more time on this, but I think there's something really, really sort of rubs me the wrong way also about this. It just, it feels like these are comparisons that shouldn't be made, or these are, it sort of challenges me to ask the question, what is the reason Rabbi Yossi Bar Chanina is making this argument? He can either make this argument because it's a nice turn of phrase and it's an interesting idea. Could be that he really believed this and here's his justification. What do we think Rabbi Yossi Bar Chanina is saying about King Achashverosh or priestly vestments? What do we think he's trying to say here? Or what might he be trying to say? We don't have to know for sure.
Well, the king is trying to take on another aspect of leadership that really he is not entitled to. And because he's a king, it's dangerous because people could follow him because of his position and feel that this is perfectly all right behavior.
Right. So in the sense that because not just is he a king, but by wearing these clothes, he could be
He's taking on,
expand his authority, at least in the eyes of the people. And maybe that's a warning for us in the sense that maybe we have to be careful not to become Achashverosh in that and not take on beyond what we are capable of as individuals. Yeah, Sheila.
Sorry, I'm late, so
That's okay.
I may be repeating something. What strikes me then is that he's trying to show that Achashverosh is an idiot. He does whatever somebody tells him to do.
Say more about that. Why do you think? Why do you think that says this says that?
He makes Achashverosh, what's his name, Mordechai, a minister because he read the book. He doesn't pay attention to what Haman does. He throws Haman right away. He doesn't ask Haman, why did you do that? But immediately when we talk about it being a parody, it's also the way it's written. This is not consistent really with the Bible. Let's put it this way. I think even with the whole Bible, where you just suddenly hang everybody without giving them a chance to defend themselves. And you don't hang the sons for the father's
Sins.
guilt. And then he can't retrieve his laws because he's already promulgated. Well, that could be, but then he just absents himself from the whole scene. It's just like, okay, you don't have to kill, you can defend yourself. He does nothing to keep his own people from fighting them.
All right. I want to pause for a sec because there's an amazing transition to what's coming next. So we're going to just pause for a sec. I want to pull out what you were saying, which is if we take the broader context and understand that Achashverosh is not a wise person, right, or certainly a potentially foolish person, then his choice here to wear priestly vestments or to be instructed to wear priestly vestments might be representative of, it's like, what is this guy doing, right? This is a ridiculous choice, right? Not one that we should derive intentional meaning from, but this is such a bonehead move, for lack of a better way of putting it, right?
Isn't it a bonehead move the way he picks Esther? Doesn't do any inquiry who the hell she is.
Sure.
Especially since she's making, certain requests.
So, all right. So we're gonna read on because I think this is a great transition.
I've got another little problem that all of a sudden just struck me. Why was Mordechai associated with this bumbling idiot king? Why would he want to be associated?
with Achashverosh.
Yes,
I mean, he's the king.
I know, but
bumbling idiot or
why?
not,
Why? How did he become his minister or in his court? And why would he want to be?
Ron,
I
you
mean-
take what you get.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's an interesting conversation here about, not necessarily here, but in the context of Purim more broadly, right? Conversations about power and proximity to power. All right, I'm going to pause for a second, like I told you before, because I'm going to go get my
Yeah,
child
we hear it.
who's
We
crying.
hear it.
I will be right back. You can continue talking, but I'll be right back.
It's interesting how many idiots there really are in the Bible.
Except for one of the things that was said earlier, the fact that he had people to his party. Among the stated people that are important was he had an army.
Yes.
He can stay in power and be as stupid as he likes if he has an army to support him.
Well,
There's
they
certain,
were also his protection there, I imagine.
That's right.
So with this in mind, let's read this next paragraph, which asks the question: was he clever or foolish? Sheila, why don't you read this for us? The verse
The
states.
verse states that, and when these days were fulfilled, the king made a feast. Excuse me, made a feast for all of the people that were present in Shushan, the capital. Rav and Shmuel disagreed as to whether this was a wise decision. One says, Achashverosh arranged a feast for the residents of Shushan, the capital, after the feast for foreign dignitaries that preceded it, as mentioned in the earlier verses, indicating that he was a clever king.
All right, let's pause. Pause before you go on, Sheila. All right, so we have, remember, this section of Gemara is just going verse by verse and offering interpretation. So it's not necessarily talking about the priestly vestments anymore. We have the next verse, right? Verse 5, which says, when these days were fulfilled, the king made a feast for all the people and those that were present in Shushan, the capital. Now, this is in contrast, or at least in context, with our first verse, which was Persia and Media being, these ministers from Persia and Media being close by. Rav and Shmuel are trying to decide what is the meaning of the choice that the feast was for the people in Shushan. That's the question. One of them, and we don't know whether it's Rav or Shmuel, who are the Hillel and Shammai of their age, right? One says arranging, right, a feast for Shushan, the local population, after foreign dignities, right, is the action of a clever king. All right, go on, Sheila.
And the other one says it is precisely this that indicates he was a foolish king. The one who said that this proves that he was clever maintains that he acted well when he first brought close those more distant subjects by inviting them to the earlier celebration, as he would appease the residents of his own city whenever he wished, as he could appease. And the one who said that he was foolish maintains that he should have invited the residents of his city first, so that if those faraway subjects rebelled against him, those who lived close by would have stood by him. That's an interesting point.
Okay, so what are we saying here? Which is that right, the question is when he invites the local population, and as a result being supported by the local population, is sort of the factor of whether or not he's clever or foolish, according to this framework, right? One says, right, by taking the more distant subjects and inviting them earlier, right, is wise because you can always celebrate your locality whenever you wish. And the one who says that he was foolish says you should invite your local population first, celebrate your immediate population, and then invite far away, foreign, distant folks, because if the faraway folks decided to rebel because they're far away, at least the people who are local, who have been celebrated, would have stood by you. What do people think?
What we don't know, what it does not say, is when did he invite the locals? Did he invite them after, it could have been a week later, or did he tell them at the party, oh, by the way, you can come tomorrow, I have a party for you?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and let's just briefly look at the verse, right? So we read this a little bit before, right?
In answer to your question, you keep your friends close and your enemies closer. So it makes sense
Right.
to make friends with the people who might be your enemy before you worry about your own people.
Nice. So that is in opposite with what the person in the Gemara is saying is wise. But I think it's a fair point, right? I'm not suggesting, the Gemara is right by any means, but just to Sheila's question, right? It happened that he was he reigned over all these places. He occupied the throne in Shushan, right? That places us in the locality of Shushan. In the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a banquet for all of the faraway folks, Persia and Media. I think that's the premise. And that 180 days he was celebrating whatever. At the end of this period, now we're in verse 5, the king gave a banquet for 7 days in the court of the king's palace garden for all the people who lived in Shushan, everybody, meaning to say faraway first, then local. And so
I think he probably feared the distant ones more than he can keep a hand on what's close by and see what's going on. But
right, I think that's the same argument you and Ron are both making, right? Keep your friends close and your enemies even closer. The people you're afraid of, bring them in, get them connected. Which means that the first argument would suggest that he's clever. What he did was clever, as opposed to foolish.
Basically, we're trying to prove that he was a smart guy and not the bumbling idiot that we really portray him in the Megillah.
I think what this invites in us is the sense that it's not as obvious as it appears. I happen to agree with what you said before, Sheila, that he does appear bumbling throughout the Megillah. I think we are meant to understand that he is not particularly savvy. But when we have interpretations like this, it becomes a little bit more that the rabbis might not have been as comfortable or as willing to make those kinds of distinctions, to give him more benefit of the doubt. Yeah, Sheila.
Well, the two things. One is sometimes you become bumbling. You sort of put people off the track. In other words, they think you're an idiot, so therefore they will talk to you and say things in front of you that they think you don't understand. So sometimes bumbling, looking like a bumbler, is part of your act. The second thing is, what it seems to say to me is what some people think, that this is all a parody and that they are leaving out significant parts in between because it is a parody. But Achashverosh did live, right?
As far as I know, that somebody about that time.
We have a record of his having existed.
Right.
But we don't know what kind of king he was, or do we?
I don't. We might collectively, but I don't. Off the top of my head, I don't.
Yeah, but it's so, as I said, he just sort of skip. It's like subtitles, and you're missing the rest of the paragraph in the whole Megillah. They're just telling you certain points. They're telling you certain things to make certain points, and they leave it to your imagination. And just think what we do for it on Purim.
Yeah, I think that's right. Let's take a pause.
So before we move right on, I have
Eric.
the new Rabbinical Assembly Book of Esther Megillah, the big blue cover that B'nai Yeshurun is going to be using this year, I think for the second time. And there's a lot of interpretation in here. And the very, very first chapter introduction describes the king of Persia as a dull-witted despot. So that
He's
was
a
very
what?
bored.
Eric,
Who was-
Eric, repeat it.
He's described as a dull-witted despot.
Okay.
Right.
Okay, and very bored. And so all this excess was just because he was bored.
Yeah, I think that this is, I don't think this is an answerable question. Let's read this note here on this page, which goes to speak to this question too. Can I get a volunteer to read where it says clever or foolish king here?
I'll continue.
Go for it.
Clever or foolish king. This dispute concerning Ahasuerus' reputation still exists among historians today. His character, as it appears from the lines of the book of Esther, and more so from the Midrash, is that of an unbalanced man who is easily influenced by his advisors and chamberlains, unstable and controlled by the women of his palace. In addition, the Greeks he fought against and to whom he suffered a number of defeats vilified him in several ways. Their description of him is quite negative. However, Ahasuerus succeeded in the early years of his rule until his mind was put at ease, as mentioned earlier. He quelled several rebellions in Egypt and Babylonia and proved his militaristic abilities in these wars. His grandiose initiative to build Persepolis and other cities with enormous buildings demonstrates his ingenuity and cleverness, although it appears that a large portion of the assets that he amassed through intensive taxation were used entirely for this purpose. Therefore, it is difficult to reach a uniform classification of his character and achievements.
Great, thank you, Jackie. Right, so here, we're not going to resolve it today about whether or not we think King Ahasuerus is wise or foolish. But it's interesting to take, the bits of evidence and say, which is it? And here we have this conversation by Rav and Shmuel about the realpolitik of what it means to be a king of a large nation with states that live far away and the people who live there being far away. And I think that's fascinating. This takes an exactly opposite direction. And I want to, before we read this, there's a great, if I remember correctly, it's attributed to Rav Kook, who says, bear with me, I know this is going to be a huge departure of what we were just talking about, that the reason that the temples were destroyed were because of sinat chinam. People heard this before? Sinat chinam being baseless hatred. This works, this argument works under a theology that we are to blame for our own suffering. Now, I'm not suggesting that we should ascribe to that view. I do think baseless hatred is bad and we should avoid it, and bad things happen when we do that, for sure. But this thread of blame of the Jewish people blaming ourselves for punishment already pejorative, right? Of sufferings experienced because they are punishments is a thread that shows up in the Talmud, and that is what we're going to see here about this question. Now, before we read it, it says the students of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai asked him, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. We got this little P. These are my favorite notes in the entire this section of Talmud, which gives us little biographies, right? Nelson, I see that you just joined us. Do you feel like you can read? I'd love for you to read Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai's bio.
Okay. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai was one of the greatest Tanaim of the
Tanaim, they are the rabbis of the Mishnaic period.
Of the generation prior to the redaction of the Mishnah. Rabbi Shimon was the preeminent student of Rabbi Akiva, and he considered himself Rabbi Akiva's spiritual heir. Rabbi Akiva had a great deal of respect for his student and said, "It is enough for you that I and your Creator recognize your strength." Rabbi Shimon's greatness was manifest in his mastery of both halakha and agada, and his statements can be found on all topics in every tractate of the Talmud. The halakha is not always ruled in accordance with Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai's opinion, especially in disputes with Rabbi Yosei and Rabbi Yehuda. Nevertheless, the halakha follows his opinion with regard to several core issues. He had his own unique method of deriving halakha from the Torah, as he factored in the rationale for the verse and inferred halakhic conclusions from the Bible based on the spirit and purpose of the law. Rabbi Shimon traveled to Rome as an emissary of the people, and he harbored profound enmity towards the Romans. He made no attempt to conceal his feelings of disgust for Rome, and was therefore sentenced to death and forced into hiding for many years. He was an ascetic by nature. He was very exacting, and he was famous in his generation for his righteousness and his performance of miracles. There are many anecdotes related in the Talmud about miraculous acts he performed. The Sifrei, a collection of halachic derivations on Numbers and Deuteronomy, was developed in his study hall. He's also credited with having authored the fundamental Kabbalistic work, the Zohar. His greatest students were Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda, and his son Rabbi Eliezer ben Rabbi Shimon, who was also among the most prominent Tanaim.
Awesome. Thank you, Nelson. Yeah, sorry, go on. What were you going to say?
Well, I was saying that he actually didn't write the Zohar, did he?
No, I was gonna mention that. So in the Talmud, he's just this incredible, fascinating character. He's the one who has laser eyes, if you've ever heard that story. The Zohar was really written in about the 13th, 14th, 15th centuries and is attributed to Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, but is most likely not written by him, but by people of those centuries. And you know this because it's written in a sort of version of the Aramaic found in the Jerusalem Talmud, but it's not the same Aramaic as the Jerusalem Talmud. So it's attributed to him. It's sort of in his name, but it's not really him, right? So for example, if I wrote a book and I said, and I attributed it to William Shakespeare, right? And people believed me. That doesn't mean that it was written by William Shakespeare. It was attributed to him. We can imagine that it was from him. It was in his style, whatever, right? I'm not going to write a book like that, so don't worry. But he clearly, in so many ways, and here we just sort of get a taste of it in his bio, he is just a monumental figure, whether in actuality or in attribution. I think he probably was. He's just deeply fascinating, powerful figure in these stories. Okay, with all of that being said, let's read a little bit about what he said. Maddie, will you read it for us?
Sure. The students of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai asked him, for what reason were the enemies of Jewish people a euphemism for the Jewish people themselves when exhibiting behavior that is not in their best interests, in that generation deserving an annihilation? He, Rabbi Shimon, said to them, say the answer to your question yourselves. They said to him, it is because they partook of the feast of that wicked one, Achashverosh, and they partook there of forbidden foods. Rabbi Shimon responded, if so, those in Shushan should have been killed as punishment, but those in the rest of the world who did not participate in the feast should not have been killed. They said to him, then you say your response to our question. He said to them, it is because they prostrated before the idol that Nebuchadnezzar, such a long name, had made, as is recorded, that the entire world bowed down before it, except for Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah.
Okay, so we have this, and the story doesn't end here, this fascinating conversation, right? Where you have Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai students ask him a question, which is, what did we, the Jewish people, do that was deserving that basically this whole thing with Haman happened? Rabbi Shimon, in classic educator style, said, well, why don't you give me your answer first, right? Classic, ask the students to answer the question that you were just asked. One of them answers, right, because they were invited to the meal of Achashverosh, and they ate. And not only did they eat, right, they ate treif, right, according to Rabbi Steinsaltz here, right? Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai responds by saying, if that was the case, then only those in Shushan would have been killed, as opposed to what the decree in the book of Esther says. right? And so therefore that's not a good answer. And they said to him, well, what, you tell us then, right? You asked us, we asked you, you asked us, we're now asking you again. And he says, because they prostrated before an idol. And then here Rabbi Steinsaltz sort of gives us that broader context. Before we sort of unpack, yeah, Nelson.
I'm sorry, I thought the sort of the ad hoc phrase was that everything was kosher at the king's table.
Is there a question there?
No, but when you're invited to the king's table, you can't insult him, so you have to eat. That was the idea.
I see. Yeah, well, I mean, certainly Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai doesn't find that argument particularly compelling either, right? That being said, I'm not sure that I agree with your takeaway. Show up at the king's table and everything's kosher. Although there's a very realpolitik, or very pragmatic approach. No argument there. Let's read the rest of the story here. They said to him, this is Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai's students said to him, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, but if it is true that they worshipped idols and therefore deserve to be destroyed, again, we're talking about Jewish people taking actions to talk about their own annihilation. Why was a miracle performed on their behalf? Meaning to say, if they had done something wrong and they were deserving of punishment, why did God save them here? Or, the miracle, right? In the book with no gods mentioned, as Ron reminded us earlier. Is there favoritism expressed by God here? Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai said to them, they did not really worship the idol, but pretended to do so only for appearance, acting as if they were carrying out the king's command to bow before the idol. So too, the Holy One, blessed be God, did not destroy them, but did act angry with them only for appearance. God too merely pretended to desire to destroy them, as all God did was issue a threat. Right? This is acting through the book. But in the end, the decree was annulled. As this is as it was written, for God does not afflict from God's heart willingly, but only for appearance's sake. So here, the argument is, why did this whole thing happen with Haman? It was God acting through human beings that the people were sort of pretending to do something wrong, and God was pretending to punish them. And this whole thing, was an act. I'm not sure who it was an act for, but an act. What do people think? This is quite a version of the story, and certainly lends to the idea that this is sort of a parody from this very beginning, differently than we normally read it, though. What do people think?
I think that after the golden calf, the only reason Israel was saved was for appearances.
Say more about that.
Well, because Moshe complained to God that if you killed the people after you took them out from Egypt, they'll say that you couldn't whatever through the desert. You couldn't. What's the word?
Right. The nations.
You know what I'm trying to say.
I do. That the nations would speak poorly of God if God took the people out of Egypt and then killed them. Right. That wouldn't look so great. And here too, we're making sort of a similar argument. It's interesting. I hadn't thought of that. There is a midrash elsewhere that suggests that the Jewish people were forced to take on the mitzvot. They were the mountain was overturned, sort of threatening to take on the commandments. And it was only at this time, the time of the story of Purim, that they truly accepted the mitzvot. And this is the moment when the people really became the people. Now, Sheila, I can see that you do not accept this answer, and I think that's fair. But here, this would make sort of a similar sort of, agreement that there's something funny is happening here. Sheila, tell me what you don't like.
It doesn't flow.
I don't think it's a strong argument either.
Huh?
I don't think it's a strong argument either. I agree with you.
It's just, it's like a bunch of statements that they're trying to retrofit to the facts. And my standard line is they have nothing else to do, so that they sit and pick up on these things. Right. I mean, I respect, please understand, and this is for the benefit of those listening also, I respect the Talmud. It is amazing how they will pick things apart and come to rules. I mean, the line is, there's a famous one, about washing, well, okay, it's a bit off the top, but it's about Nitzilat Yadayim. My granddaughter had to write a Mishnah on Nitzilat Yadayim, or at least write a Mishnah, and she did it on that. And she went, and it was like, how do you wash your hands? This is, by the way, at the beginning, somehow I think there was a pandemic. It wasn't the current pandemic. But some other time, she was showing how you have to go under the nail bed, in the cuticle. This is what the Talmud does. And that is wonderful, because that's what law is, to go all the little things. But in this case, they're not going to the little things. They're just talking. Yeah, it's not, there's no value. Let's put it this way. There is no value in what they are saying.
So I'm going to disagree with you there, and I'm going to offer my own take, and folks you can take this or leave it as well. I think each of these texts, right? We've read now a couple of paragraphs. We go up. We talked about this question about why these words are in one order. Ahasuerus wearing the priestly vestments, whether or not he was foolish. This whole story with Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai, and whether or not the Jews were punishing, and God appearing, this thing or the other thing. I think each of these actually works really well with the theme of Passover. Theme of Passover more broadly, or Purim, sorry, which is each of these arguments are one in which the obvious and the hidden overlap, which is perfectly in theme with what Purim is, right? Which is that the hidden and the revealed things are not what they appear. Each of these teachings sort of play with that idea, right? The order of operations tells us something, right? It's not exactly obvious. If we go up here, right, that he's wearing priestly vestments, which is strange. So the outside and the inside are not quite in alignment. We have whether or not he's foolish, right? Is he really what he appears to be? And here again, the punishment, is it really what it appears to be? And so I think in each step, and this is where I think I disagree with you, Sheila, I think they are telling us something. They're just not telling us straight out. That they need us, this is a reminder, right? That Talmud is a pedagogical document. It's not just a legal one. It's telling us all sorts of things. And here, I think the subtext is as important as the text, which is to say, things are not always obvious. And we have to look deeper. We have to challenge deeper. Now, I don't mean these texts in specific, but I think that's the lesson being learned if you are a student of Talmud, is we have to look deeper. What is hidden that we can't see on the surface? And sometimes it looks a little bit like Narishkeit, no argument. But that there's more there than it appears. Nelson and then Sheila.
I was just going to say that when you misspoke and said this was about Passover, I found it much more interesting. I was waiting for the analysis. That's all.
Yeah, I mean, I misspoke. Well, certainly that's what I would say. But there's a whole Masechet on Pesachim, on Passover, and the whole last chapter 10, I think, is all about the Seder. There's so much there, right, that we could learn for the holiday. Sheila.
When we first learned the story, when we were in elementary in Hebrew, Talmud Torah, okay? I don't know what they do in a day school. A day school, I think they study it line by line pretty much. But we're telling the kids the story of Purim and whatnot. And Ahasuerus, I mean, he's almost a hero to us there in a sense. The way we tell the story is so different from when you think about it. Even if it's a parody, what are they trying to say in the parody? You really have to study it and not take this very glib thing. And thank God they have, when you do go to say a conservative or reform place, you have an English translation, you have English comments. And we're getting more and more comments being written on the Megillah than when I was growing up. I mean, Michael didn't have a lot of old Megillot with different comments. I think it started with Rabbi Gordis. There was one there
Yeah,
And then,
yeah.
yeah,
I think
now,
you-
it's like every year, there's a new one.
I think you're exactly right. Excuse me. You're exactly right that there's much more in the Megillah than we appear. I actually have a copy. I don't know if you can see this blue book right here. It's actually it's a book of just commentaries to Megillah Esther. I have more than one. There's so much there that we don't unpack every year that we could. So I wholeheartedly agree with you there. Jackie, and then we'll end for the day. I'll give you the last word.
Two things. One is I have wondered why Megillat Esther was not included in the basics in the
What
Torah.
basics?
Number one,
What do you mean? What do you mean by
What do you mean
basics?
by the basics?
by the 5 books.
Yeah,
Five
I mean, arguably there probably should be 6 books. That the book of
That's
Joshua should
Yeah.
be really, because that's where the story where it starts off with creation and ends
Right.
with entering the land. So yeah, it's an interesting question, even just more broadly of canonization and Esther's inclusion. Your second point.
And my second question, not a question, but I don't remember exactly where it is. But one of the things that we are taught as a premise in Judaism, that it's not even good to give the appearance of the breaking of the rules, because it encourages people to do so.
Right, we have the concept of marit ayin, which is that people will see us, and that if we do something that is so obviously prohibited, it might or something that doesn't look obviously prohibited but could be misconstrued, might lead other people astray. Certainly a thing, and that's a great piece, a challenge to this interpretation. Ron, I'm going to give you the last word, and then we're going to end for the day.
Right. Well, first I'm going to go way off the wall here. And then I have a couple questions for you after that. But I've been thinking about whether the connections between Purim and Passover. And I'm thinking to myself, they both start with a fast day. Tanit Esther versus the fast of the firstborn. And then the next thing you've got is a feast when everything's hunky-dory. And that they're both redemption holidays. One we were pulled out of Egypt, and the other one we were just saved. We're in place. So I'm starting out thinking that there's a lot of connection there that we can make if we want to.
That's interesting. Has there ever been anything written about it?
I'm sure there has.
It's an interesting thing. I wrote something a few years ago about the two holidays or the connection between the two. I think there's a lot there for sure. All right.
But there's also the flippant that every Jewish holidays they try to kill us. We won. Let's eat.
Yeah.
All right. So
Certainly
the next connection I found, and I haven't been studying this, in Esther 1:6, it talks about karpas.
Yes, it does use that word, and the section of Talmud we didn't get to.
And the very next word after karpas is techelet. So now it's talking about the talus.
There's a great interpretation in this Talmud that goes through those words.
And then I go a couple of more words, and I'm seeing the combination of wool and linen. I'm saying shatnez. Everything is in this one half of a pasuk. So anyway, so that's what I wanted to say. Now I have a question for you. I sometimes, not always, skim your blog post every week, and it seems to follow our class. Are you writing that after the class or before the class?
I write it after the class.
So if we come up with anything good, it gets in there then.
Yes, they're not always. It's not a one-to-one, but it's pretty close. I take inspiration from all of you. All right, with that, I'm happy to talk more about the newsletter in a minute. We're going to end the class there. So Shabbat Shalom, everybody.